Let's face facts. The US was instrumental in the creation of ISIL. America's Persian Gulf allies helped them, as the Vice President Joe Biden has already acknowledged. The US also exploited the existence of ISIL against other forces in the region as part of a wider drive to maintain Western control. During US Secretary of State John Kerry's visit to Italy, he and the Italian Foreign Minister held a press conference and vowed to crush ISIL terrorists. Despite the US and its allies claiming to use airstrikes against ISIL rather than against the Syrian government, the conference was disrupted when a journalist shouted at Kerry, "It's you who created Daesh." ISIL terrorists were initially trained by the CIA to destabilize the Syrian government. ISIL now controls much of Iraq and Syria, using horrific violence such as public beheadings and crucifixions against Shias, Sunnis, Kurds and Christians. How should John Kerry be held to account over ISIL? Why don't Americans speak out against Washington's use of terrorists in the Middle East? And how should the US be punished for having trained ISIL militants? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. How do you feel about the fact that the US's intelligence agency, the CIA, trained potentially tens of thousands of ISIL militants in Jordan in 2012? That's what we put to the American public.
I can't say I'm really that surprised because there's a long history of the United States training people in Middle Eastern countries, and then it turns out we wind up going in there and essentially fighting those exact people.
I don't doubt it. I don't feel that I have access to adequate information to have an opinion on it.
That's still up for debate as to whether that has happened or not. I guess only time will tell whether we really find out whether that really happened or not.
I'm sincerely hoping that that is not accurate. I try to not let myself be influenced by things that I can't verify. There's too much rumor going around right now, and everybody likes to play the telephone game, and it starts out small and then it gets bigger and bigger. I don't want to believe it's true, but I know that a lot of times everything starts from a grain of truth. It's impossible for things not to have slipped through the cracks. There's always a loophole in every system and a leak in every system, so I'm hoping it's not on that scale. I don't believe it would be on that scale, but it's terrifying, actually.
How do our experts feel about the CIA's involvement in training thousands of ISIL militants prior to ISIL's significant advances in the region?
Well, obviously it's very clear that there has been a plan, a strategy by the US to train the so-called Islamic State militants in Jordan and other periphery countries. But Jordan has been the main, if you like, the ground on which a lot of these militants have been supported, trained. But what's really interesting is that even the US doesn't have any figures as to how many numbers that have been trained over the last 3-4 years. But what is clear is that these are not just terrorists, they're actual mercenaries. They have been hired, for want of a better word, for money, literally, to go and fight a war in a foreign country. And USA and its intelligence services have recruited these individuals from different parts of the world, some from Europe, even in the UK. We have over 1,000 individuals who are supposedly now in Syria via Jordan and also Turkey. But Jordan has been the main as I said, the training ground where a lot of these terrorists have been hosted.
It comes no surprise to me that the CIA were training tens of thousands of Daesh militants in Jordan in 2012, because the whole project against Libya and then Syria was exactly to rely on in these precise proxy forces to facilitate their strategic objectives in North Africa and the Middle East, and particularly in Syria. Jordan obviously is a friendly country to the United States. The United States has intelligence swapping, military intelligence swapping with junior partners of it in the region, including Jordan. So absolutely, the United States must rely on these forces to seek their strategic objectives in the Muslim world.
During US Secretary of State John Kerry's recent visit to Italy, a female journalist directly criticised him for creating ISIL. How should he be punished for his role in the creation of ISIL? The public said this.
I mean, obviously everyone should be held responsible for anything that they're responsible for. I don't know enough about politics to know how exactly he should be punished, but definitely some responsibility should be taken. So hopefully he addresses it at least.
Again, I kind of feel the same way, where I don't trust any of the news sources. I don't know who has the correct information. So in terms of punishment, I don't have children, so I don't know how to govern anybody for that matter.
Unless we can definitely determine that it was his fault, he's not guilty until charged, so to speak.
I'm not sure if I'm one that's qualified to say how a particular former state of what's the term? Secretary of State would get punished for military crimes, especially if, you know, I don't know if there's any way to quantify that it's their fault specifically without any trial, and I don't foresee John Kerry going to trial.
How should John Kerry be sanctioned for his involvement in the creation of ISIL? Here's the view of our experts.
Well, it's not just Kerry. Obviously, you know, he's the Secretary of State, therefore the buck stops at him, if you like. But really the whole administration, that includes the ministry, the defense ministry, the president, the secret services, the whole political elite, including the Congress and the House of Representatives, should not only be reprimanded, but if there is any particular course of action that needs to be taken, which can be translated into punishment or at least some kind of court hearing to show the world that what US has done is particularly heinous. It has created not only a monster that is going to come and bite us in Europe and America itself, but the difficulties, the sectarian problem that has been created via these terrorists in Syria and Iraq and the wider Muslim world is nothing short of criminal activity on part of the USA. And Kerry being, if you like, the individual who sits at the head of a department which has been instrumental in creating and supporting and sustaining these terrorists. So perhaps it would be appropriate for Kerry to be tried for crimes which are against humanity, because at the end of the day, when you look at it, that tens of thousands of people have been killed and murdered in Syria. And, you know, people talk about, and Mr. Kerry has a tendency of talking about and saying that Assad is to blame for this. But the reality is that for the last 5 years or 6 years, the whole displacement of people that has taken place, the refugees who are coming into Europe, and also the killings that are taking place in Syria and Iraq are nothing but the doing of USA and its allies, creating a situation whereby terrorists have found a home to implement the policies that they want to.
The creation of Daesh and other similar death squad forces by leading Western powers, including the United States, and leading politicians, is an act of criminality. It's illegal under international law to proliferate and infiltrate death squads into a sovereign country, be it Libya, Iraq, Syria, etc. The problem is, in the global south, we do not have the capacity or the mechanisms based on that capacity to bring war criminals like John Kerry and all of his other senior colleagues to trial for what they've done. But God willing, in the future, with the successes of the Global South struggle, that it won't be too far in the distant future that the Global South will be able to arrest these war criminals and bring them to justice.
The US has used terrorist networks as a proxy in the Middle East to advance America's own regional interests. Why don't Americans speak out against this? We asked them.
That's a good question. I feel like people aren't informed, and maybe until now they necessarily didn't care until we see things happen in real life. I find it very out of touch. So until things start happening like they have recently, it becomes more prevalent.
I mean, if that's true, I mean, that's a conflict of interest. I mean, hey, you got to get your intel how you could get it, but I mean, be careful who you put your alliances to. You know, it's like information comes out later. You know.
I think a lot of times because Americans don't realize that it's happening, and until you watch a YouTube video about how certain conflicts arise, because we have our own interests overseas and we have our own interests that, you know, complicate our economy and complicate our strategies with the relationships of other countries. So it's a very difficult thing for people to know, and it's probably not the first thing that that the president is going to talk about, because it's just going to raise red flags for the general public.
I think a lot of it is because Americans aren't always aware of what's going on, and for good reason. I don't know if you're aware, but there was a time while we were in Iraq and Afghanistan early on that the Wall Street Journal, I read an article in the Wall Street Journal about plans that it had for how it was going to do specific things in Afghanistan and Iraq, and my first thought was, you know, everybody's talking about the public's right to know and the public's right to know. And really what you're doing is you're drawing a target on the backs of those soldiers. I mean, do you honestly think that people on the other side of the ocean can't get access to the Wall Street Journal? I think that there are reasons why they plan some things, and I do not believe that the American public should be allowed to access it until the operations are complete, because if the American public can access it, so can the people the operations are against.
Yeah, I feel like that's been going on for a really long time. I'm not comfortable with it. Again, I'm not involved in that situation at all. I don't know a whole lot about it, but I've heard about that. And that's worrisome. It feels a little bit like a double cross. You trust your government to be taking care of you and watching out for you, and kind of like you have an enemy, and then you suddenly realize they're kind of in cahoots with them, or it's very weird.
Can our experts clarify the American public's apparent unwillingness to attack their country's use of terrorist groupings to help with American regional interests?
Well, firstly, it's abundantly clear that over the last 30, 40 years, not only in the Middle East, but also in South America, America and the CIA have created terrorist organizations to, dismantle, to get rid of democratically elected leaders in South America. So the same thing has been operating in the Middle East. And Mrs. Clinton quite proudly not long ago said that we created Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan 30 years ago, and there's ample evidence to show that that was done, and documentary evidence, as I said, Mrs. Clinton and other dignitaries of the American administration at that time have spoken what part they played in creating Al-Qaeda. So the similar model has been used in the last 5-10 years to create other terrorist organizations in the Middle East. However, your question, why have not the American people spoken against this? The sad pity is that, you've got TV channels in USA which pump out the same utter nonsense which is promoted by the ruling elite. Therefore, the ordinary man and woman in the streets of Washington, New York and LA is probably not aware as to what's going on. And they've been sort of cushioned, or not cushioned, actually been deprived of the reality of what's happening on behalf of them in the Middle East.
Increasing amount of Western people are understanding the sordid relationship between Western ruling circles and the use of regional powers and death squads in achieving their strategic objectives. The problem is most of this understanding is happening in the trajectory of right-wing and nearly fascistic Eurocentric understanding, i.e. the essentialization of Muslims and Arabs as terrorists, etc. And the opposition kind of has this framework that these horrible Western powers are allying up with horrible radical Muslims, which are essentialized, etc. So there's a challenge for anti-imperialists to counter to present a counter-argument that's more accurate to the truth, that actually Western powers are allying with a minority of people in the Muslim world, and in the Muslim community it's a minority of people who are supporting these death squads, etc. But yes, Western people are increasingly understanding the relationship between their own governments and these supremacist armed gangs.
Michael Morell, former acting director of the CIA, has called for talks with the Saudis about how their support of Wahhabism should be treated. Why hasn't the US said or done anything about this in nearly 100 years? The public shared their views.
I really can't answer that. I don't want to pretend like I have an opinion. I don't know.
I think the more communication from both sides, the better. The more everybody talks to everybody, the better, you know. So, you know, less communication, more isolation, less chance for there to be growth and change, and for us to settle these issues.
I don't have an answer for that one.
I'm wondering why we're doing it now. There's a fine line that Americans tend to cross a lot. We do try to police the world a bit. And there's certain things that we just don't necessarily have the right. In the last 100 years, we do not have the right to infringe upon the last 100 years of sovereignty of another country, and especially when it comes to religion. Now, once your way of promoting a religion becomes more violent, that's a different issue, because that's no longer about the religion, that's about how you're treating other human beings. But when it comes to just the fact that it exists and people are trying to expand it, every religion on the planet does that. We don't have the right always to step in, and it's not our job to step in. Why do people in the home country not say anything about it? Why is that always something that Americans and America as a whole is being blamed for not having done something? But if we do something, we're blamed for that too. Like we're actually one of the youngest countries in existence. Like, all of the European countries have been there a lot longer than us. Why is everybody looking towards us with expecting us to know the answers to everything?
I have no idea. I don't know.
A century is a long time for America to take no action over the Saudi backing for Wahhabism, an ideology that also underpins ISIL. Can our experts explain this long-term lack of action?
Well, I don't think a discussion needs to take place, because there's no need for a discussion. What needs to be done is very clearly for USA, our country, Britain, and a lot of other European countries stop trading with Saudi Arabia, stop supplying armaments which are used in Yemen, in Bahrain, and other locations to kill civilians. So a discussion means that there will be some end conclusion. Discussion, what the CIA head is talking about, is just to camouflage saying that we are talking with the Saudis. But the reality is that our government and the government in Washington continues to support the Saudi regime when they clearly know that it is Wahhabism which has inspired these Salafi groups and the ISIS and ISIL, and the money, the armament, all these being sort of supplied and taken through Saudi is really very clear. And the same thing, as I said earlier, happened in Afghanistan when Saudi supported Al-Qaeda, and that's what they're doing at this time. So the issue of discussion, as I say, is not on the agenda. Clear steps must be taken by Washington to cut off its links from Saudi Arabia if it wants really to dismantle the menace that has been created by the Saudi regime.
It's totally rich coming from any leading Western politician, let alone a former director of the CIA, to lecture the Saudis about Wahhabism and these armed supremacist gangs. Indeed, first it was Britain and then the United States who have kept a lifeline to Riyadh to enable it to have hegemony in the Muslim world. So actually, the more powerful, the more culpable parties in this criminal enterprise are not in Riyadh actually, although they're definitely the junior partners in this criminal enterprise, but the senior partners, the masterminds of this, the people who are supplying the money, the weaponry and the media to Riyadh, is regimes like the UK and the USA.
The US has no record as to how many ISIL militants it has trained. How should the US be punished for having trained ISIL militants in the first place? We gave the public their chance to pass judgment.
I think the people involved and what needs to happen is there needs to be a thorough investigation as to what was done, and specific names happen. Like there's a chain of events. It's not a random flood of anything. Somewhere along the lines, when things go bad, somebody did something, and we need to find out specific parties responsible.
Again, we can't confirm that we trained these militants. Unless we can confirm it, definitely, beyond a shadow of a doubt, we can't say one way or another whether there should be punishment or not.
Well, I think that's the question. You can't really quantify how many have been trained. It's not like we can track those folks who have been trained by military methods and who has become a part of ISIL and who has become a part of a local militia that's fighting ISIL and so on and so forth. How do you know?
How should America be punished for its role in training ISIL militants? We gave the last word to our experts.
The numbers is very difficult to quantify because there's a lot of individuals who've gone from different parts of the world to join ISIL and have been trained by US in one way or another, either by direct training or by creating camps whereby these foreign mercenary terrorists had a sanctuary. So I don't know whether any catalogue of individuals was ever kept, but it's abundantly clear that there are no clear records of how many there are and from which country. There is some evidence from each of the respective countries like Britain, Germany, France, Belgium, where they've said that their nationals have been trained and are fighting now in Syria. And the issue of how the US should be punished is in reality very clear that people or the nations should stop some kind of trading activity with the USA, perhaps stop doing international transactions in dollars, like Iran has decided at this moment to transact all its business, petroleum business in dollars. So the best way to punish USA, I believe, is to decouple the international business from the dollar base that it is at this moment.
There's no doubt in my mind that there's bureaucracy and paperwork that will show exactly how many supremacist armed gangs the United States has helped to train in the Middle East in this 5 years of the Arab sting. Similarly to Iraq, there will be leaks in the future, perhaps not as much as Iraq, because this is much more of a covert operation than the Iraq war was in 2003. And the United States and the UK have learned to sophisticate and to cover their tracks much more effectively than they have with Iraq. But it will come out in the future, and it is coming out in a drip fashion, the role of the United States in the leadership of this whole sordid mess.
It's time to face facts. The US helped to create ISIL. In a political world where the US accuses many countries of creating, funding, harbouring and encouraging terrorism, it would be absurd to absolve the US of its role in helping to develop the biggest threat to peace in the Middle East. America may now wish to disguise its responsibility for helping to build ISIL into a fighting machine. But the mess it helped to create proves both the role of terrorism in American foreign policy and the inescapable fact that cynical actions speak far louder than sanctimonious words.